All right, so the questions are already flying in. Let's start off with our top-rated one. This is for you, Alex, I think. One of the biggest challenges for developers is financing. Banks and credit unions often avoid land financing, which restricts entry for new developers and builders. And what can be done about this from a financial institution perspective?
Yeah, I alluded to it in my comments. One of the things that we've been pushing for with OSFI is reducing the capital risk weights with land acquisition as well as development construction. Right now, these rules are sort of internationally agreed upon, but frankly, we don't believe that they reflect the performance in this country. As I mentioned, defaults are low. Losses are low in this area, and we'd like to ensure that capital risk weights reflect that reality. So that's something we've been pushing for at a federal level with OSFI, and I think we're beginning to get traction with that. So we're hopeful we're going to see some movement and potentially a public consultation on this, maybe even early next year. Remains to be seen.
Great, and I'll be a little more controversial for you. You know, and I mentioned it earlier in my remarks, I think what we've got in OSFI, certainly since the current superintendent took over, is an incredibly small C conservative approach to all the underwriting rules and all the rest. And I know it's created a huge burden. We talk about burden of regulation, and in residential construction, it's created a huge burden, I know, for your members. And I'm often saying, I think we've taken the financial system that was the best in the world and we've tweaked it a little bit too far, be it the MQR. And, you know, the MQR was fine when interest rates were at 0.5%, but when they were, you know, up over 5, it was still testing 2 points over. So from the Canadian Bankers Association perspective, and I know you have to be a little bit careful because that's your regulator, but hey, our industry is regulated all the time and we scream about it. So where's the Canadian Bankers Association just on that sort of relationship with you know, all the tightening and everything that's gone on with OSFI, and where the opportunities are to hopefully free up to make things a little easier to build houses and get people into home ownership?
Great question. There are a few things that can be done, and you're right, we have to be a little bit careful because banks are regulated and highly regulated. We have those interactions with the regulator on a regular basis, but there's a few things that can be done. One of the things that we've been pushing for is before OSFI puts in place a rule or regulation, and this should be frankly the case for all regulators, do a cost-benefit analysis. Do the costs of that regulation outweigh, or the benefits of that regulation outweigh the costs of implementing that regulation, whether that be direct or indirect costs? And frankly, we don't see that in this country very often. There are very few regulators that undertake a cost-benefit analysis before doing a regulation. So that's number one. Number two is around capital risk levels. You know, I mentioned the ADC loans. There's Basel 3.1, also known as Basel 4. There's different terminologies, but the latest iteration of Basel requires banks to it's an international agreed upon capital framework. And the idea being, you know, Canada is very much rules-based in terms of whatever it does internationally, financing or whatever. And we tend to follow it quite closely. Well, given the performance of ADC loans, acquisition, development, construction loans, we think that there's an opportunity for OSFI to loosen the reins or acknowledge the performance and allow banks to hold less capital against ADC loans. And that's something that we're pushing for as well. And then the other thing is around the capital floor. We're seeing the US, the UK, the Europeans beginning to rethink how quickly they implement the capital output floor, which is essentially requiring large banks to hold more amounts of capital. And we've been asking OSFI don't get ahead of the curve here. Like, let's pay attention to what our international counterparts are doing, and they've heeded that, and they've paused any more increases to that capital floor, thus requiring banks to hold even more capital, and we're pleased with that. We'll just have to wait and see where that goes, especially with the United States. There's been this push in the United States to pull back on some of the more extreme regulatory capital aspects of the regime, and you're beginning to see that happen with the new administration.
Catherine, is this anything you want to weigh in on, or no, you're good? All right, I'll have one for you then. All right, so just to your point around the low price points still being restrictive, do you have any thoughts on the importance of filtering? I'm not sure if you've followed the CMHC work on filtering, which is the idea of vacancy trains, and when one person sells, then the next person's able to move in, and that filters down to the rental side of things. Or any views on that from the provincial level and the importance of providing all price points in terms of units rather than just focusing on, say, social housing?
I mean, so I haven't done a lot of reading on specific filtering as a policy, but I think that makes sense as just a general goal of a balanced housing market. And one of the things that we've seen, so it's interesting, we've seen quite an increase in building on the single family as well as the multi, but I think like one of the challenges we're seeing, and I think it's a challenge that home builders face in Alberta, I mentioned this sort of boom and bust that we tend to see. And we see that, it's really unusual to see that in population growth, frankly. And we see that here as part of just our general cycle. And so this time around, I think the composition and the fact that we brought in a lot of people from other provinces, but as well as a lot of new immigrants, non-permanent residents. We have students that are continuing to come at a slower rate, but it does speak to the importance of trying to provide that supply across all of those price points. I think the challenge is for home builders trying to manage through those booms and busts. So, how do you match that supply and demand? But I think this time around, it's been really interesting to see how builders have responded to that huge demand for rental, and that's what we're seeing coming onto the market. But of course, this idea of people being able to move through is really important, and I think probably in Calgary, given the price appreciation that we've seen, that might be a bit more challenging, for example, moving into the single family. But in Edmonton especially, and outside of Calgary, I think that's still very reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. And I, certainly from a CHBA perspective, we're always talking about the importance of supporting all parts of the spectrum. I mean, if you just do GST on entry-level housing and first-time buyers, the people who currently occupy those homes are still facing all of the cost barriers of the move-up home. So they're not moving out of that, and now we don't have enough entry-level homes. So it's, we always talk about the importance of supporting it all. I've also heard municipalities saying, yes, we want supply, but the right kind of supply, which usually talks about, supportive housing and that sort of thing. And as we talked about earlier today, if all a municipality does, or any level of government, if all they do is focus on supportive housing and affordable social housing, you'll forever be wondering why the lineup is getting longer and longer out your door, even though you're building more of these units, because we have to fix the market rate housing, or it will just continue to have these problems. All right, so time to get into your crystal ball. You guys both touched on it a little bit, but here's the question. There's been a lot of conversation about mortgage rates, and I'll differentiate a little bit because I think it's important right now. We actually have a bit of a separation right now between mortgage rates and the Bank of Canada's overnight rate, and we can talk a little bit about that. But so the question is, so those will come down this year. What's the outlook, say, for 5 years, and do we see these things climb again? I'm sure you can both weigh in on that.
So I mentioned up front that we're still expecting a few more cuts. Maybe we're a bit more optimistic than the market. I think the market's pricing in 2 more cuts this year. But our long-term, so we do forecasting on the 3-month and the 10-year, and so we're looking at a long-term rate of around 3%, just a little over 3%, which is, I think, we're not deviating much from the market from that perspective. It has been, I would say, a little bit slower. Like you mentioned, there's a bit of a gap there between what we're seeing on the overnight and mortgage rates, and probably Alex can speak to more on that. I think there is sort of that level of uncertainty that's playing into that. Excuse me. But that's where we would see things go. And so from a sort of a 5-year perspective, are we going back to the, like, I took out a mortgage in 2021, and I feel like I'm stealing the money. I got a rate of like 1.3%. It's going to renew early next year. Are we going back to those rates? No. But I think it's important to sort of put it into historical perspective that even if we see a few more rate cuts and we're looking at between 3 and 4, relatively speaking, that's still pretty low in terms of overall history. But that's where we see things going over the next little while.
So we don't do forecasting at the CBA, but I can say a few things. One is variable rate, the Bank of Canada rate has a lot of influence on variable rates. So as the Bank of Canada rates go, so do variable rates. They're highly correlated. Not because we get funding from the Bank of Canada or banks get funding from the Bank of Canada, simply just how the banks price their mortgages for variable rates. On the fixed rate side, the most popular mortgage is a 5-year rate, and that's usually the funding for that is from sort of bank deposit notes, 5-year CMBs, NHA MBS, because a lot more 5-year instruments out there. So as the Government of Canada 5-year rate goes, so will the 5-year fixed rate. And then the last thing, the Bank of Canada has been really clear about this, is interest rates will be dictated around inflation. So as inflation goes, the Bank of Canada will be focused. So inflation is the thing that I think we're watching for.
Yeah, and we're still, in our scenarios that we did for budget, going to that inflation piece. In our baseline with no tariffs, we were looking at inflation of between, I don't know, 2.2 to 2.5%. And so in a tariff scenario with some of those retaliatory tariffs, we were looking at closer to 3% was what we were forecasting for this year and over the next couple of years. So in that scenario, we still feel like there's enough room for the Bank of Canada to cut. And so that is our outlook and our expectation. We'll see where that lands. I mentioned oil prices. In our baseline, we were forecasting $68, which is looking very optimistic right now. But even having those lower energy prices, the zero carbon tax, and some of those other bits and pieces, we expect to give enough runway for the Bank of Canada to cut further. We have already started to see, so last year was pretty interesting on the goods side, because goods demand was weaker, prices actually fell in absolute terms. We're starting to see prices pick up a little bit, and that's just from the pass-through of the weaker dollar last year. So there is an expectation that we are going to see some price pressure there, but we think overall inflation won't be felt deeply enough that it'll derail some of those cuts from the Bank of Canada.
Yeah, I guess it's fair to say that, the Bank of Canada is always looking for around that 2% inflationary level. We're probably kicking in and around what they would term the neutral interest level, right? Give or take, there's probably another cut or two because we're going to need some support for the economy with the tariff stuff. But we might be right around the area right now where if all things were equal, this is where the Bank of Canada would probably like to see the overnight lending rate. Is that fair, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So on the longer term, to answer the question also, if all things being equal, tariffs settle themselves out and all the rest, maybe, we never get a steady market, but in this steady market, this is, probably what we might expect in the longer term. Mm-hmm. Alice, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but let's go to some other fun stuff here. Here's one for you, because we always, as the development industry, always get asked, well, what can you guys do to help with affordability? So here's a question for the financial institutions. What can the financial institutions do to help improve housing affordability? Any thoughts on that? Totally putting you on the spot, but
Yeah, one of the things that we've been pushing for with the CBA is just reviewing CMHC securitization programs. So reviewing the premiums. The premiums, I think we think are maybe a bit too high. They double count the premiums on certain securitization products. Have CMHC review those premiums so that will flow through the financing costs to the developer. So that's a big one where we've been asking for. And then the other one is just it's the capital risk weights and really pushing for that because I think you'll see greater capital allocation towards acquisition, development, construction loans if that gets fixed.
Great. All right. So we're pretty much out of time, but there is a fun one here. I don't know if you guys want to touch this. I'll weigh in on it, but I'll give you the first shot here. But it's the most popular question. So for first-time homebuyers, would you still say it's a good time to get into the market for home ownership in Calgary? All right, I'll get in there for you. I was like, so listen, here's what I always say. You want to go?
I was going to say, I mean, to me, this question depends on what your time horizon is, right? Like if you're speculating and you think prices are going to go up in a year or two, I would suggest just don't do it. But if you see home ownership as sort of a long-term investment, and not just an investment, shelter over your head rather than renting, yeah, probably is a good time to buy. That's if you have a long time horizon.
Yeah, and I always say, like, some people are lucky in real estate. I know my sister lived in Vancouver and she got really lucky coming back to the province, but I think home ownership is not so much about trying to beat the market. It's just about where you want to come in at and looking at on an affordability perspective, can you get in and is it something that you can afford? I know a lot of people, I remember during the 2009 recession, there were some folks that really got themselves tied up in knots about what they thought home prices were going to be. And I said, well, are you going to sell your house in the next year? Can you still afford your mortgage? Well, I think you're okay. You don't need to maybe fuss so much. And I'd say that's like the overall picture. And like Alex had mentioned, and one of the things that we've been looking at, and I wanted to mention this in my talk, is that we actually saw the financial position of Albertans strengthen at the end of last year. So you mentioned folks were paying down debt. Income levels are still really high in the province. We have seen some of our wage differential erode quite a bit compared with other jurisdictions. But overall, folks are still in a pretty good position financially. But for me, it's more about not trying to beat the market, but whether or not you can be realistic about your budget.
If I can take a page out of Warren Buffett's book, who just retired on Sunday, what did he say? Timing the market is not as important as time in the market, and I think that goes here.
Yeah, no, I'll just close with that too. Every time is a good time to get into your first home. You're going to be in the market for 30, 40 years. If you can get in, get in. It's not about timing. And frankly, if you time it right now, I would guess you guys have a great province here. You have a great city. It's going to be hard to fight rising costs over the next little while. The big question we're getting to right now, which I can address, is what's happening with this GST for first-time buyers, right? First of all, I'll say our expectation is that can't happen until there's a budget. Our expectation is there's going to be a budget in June, and we should get certainty on that elimination of GST. So hopefully we're only a few weeks off, because I know that's keeping some buyers on the sidelines. So our message is we need to get this certainty immediately. But anytime something like that comes through, it creates more demand in the marketplace. You might actually, said Kevin to a potential home buyer, you might be able to get a better deal today than you'll be able to get in a few weeks or a few months, depending on what goes on with all the other factors. It's always a good time to become a first-time home buyer. It's always a great time to become a first-time home buyer in Calgary, and I'll go to the grave saying that. All right, with that, I think we're done, Brian. Thanks a lot to the panelists. I think that's your job to do, but I wanted to say thanks. I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
Maybe I can steal your microphone, Kevin. Thank you very much. Catherine and Alex, great remarks. Kevin, thanks for your moderating. As with the other speakers, we have these nice Calgary Stampede belt buckles as a token of our appreciation and something for you to remember today. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
It's heavy, too.